Alright, so let's take a look at the modulation section within ES-2. This middle section over here is called the router. So over here you can assign any of these modulators to any of the controls in this upper section over here. So in terms of modulation, there are 2 LFOs and 3 envelopes. Envelope 3 is hardwired to control the amplitude of your sound. So it's the amp envelope. Let's try it out. That's the attack control. Decay, which would only work if the sustain is down. And I'll skip this for a second. Then you have your release. This control over here lets you control the envelope via velocity. So if it's all the way up, and let me just reduce the attack down to 0. So if I play a really loud note, and I'll put the sustain all the way up as well. So we hear the full envelope, but as I reduce the velocity, the envelope is scaled accordingly. If this is all the way down, irrespective of how loud I play, the envelope is always its full value. Now this time is kind of interesting. So if I have my sustain, let's say somewhere down there, we know that the sound is going to decay down to the sustain value. But if I have this rise time up to, let's say, a value of 800 milliseconds, the sound is now going to go back up to the full sustain value in 800 milliseconds. If I make that longer, it'll take longer. If I set it to a really short value, it jumps back up. And when you go down to these negative values, the opposite happens. So if the sustain is all the way up, it drops back down to complete silence. And how soon it drops back down to complete silence, you can control with this by setting it to, let's say, a higher value, minus 2100. So it takes that much time to drop down to silence. Now this attack control has this dual range slider. So if I set it like this, what it means is that now the attack can be varied via velocity, as it says over here, via velocity. So again, if I play a really loud note, we're hearing no attack because it's taking this value. But if I play a really soft note, we have long attack. So that's a way of assigning velocity to control the attack range. Now these 2 envelopes are pretty much the same, except that envelope 1 only has attack and decay, but envelope 2 has pretty much the same controls as envelope 3. LFO 1 and LFO 2 over here, let's have a look at them. Now these don't work by itself, they need to be assigned to something. So I'm just going to assign this LFO 1 to affect the pitch of, let's say, oscillator 1. I can do that in this router section. So where it says target, I'll select pitch 1, and where it says source, I'll select LFO 1. Let me set this rise time to 0. So this is the frequency of the LFO. We're not hearing anything because the depth is set to 0. When I click and drag this triangle up, we'll start to hear some pitch modulation. And the speed of modulation we can control with the LFO's frequency. The range is actually pretty good. It goes up all the way up to 100 Hertz. So it's almost in the FM range. Now this control over here is basically the EG delay. So if I don't want the LFO to affect the parameter, whatever the parameter is over here immediately, I can give it a bit of a delay. So let's say I set it to 630 milliseconds. So for the first 630 milliseconds of the sound, there won't be any modulation. Or let's just say it takes 630 milliseconds to gradually start modulating. I can set that to be really high. So it's kind of like a volume control or a gradual volume control of the LFO. If I set this to a negative value, we're going to hear the modulation immediately, but then it'll take 630 milliseconds to stop modulating. So if I set this to a really short amount, we have modulation just at that initial part of the sound. That could be an interesting thing to use. Alright, so that's LFO1. Now, LFO1, you can also change the waveform. Right now it's set to a triangle wave, but I can set it to the sawtooth, which is basically a ramp down. Let's slow that down a bit so we can hear it, as opposed to the triangle. Ramp up, sawtooth, but sorry, not a sawtooth, that's a square wave. There's also a square wave, but the range is from -1 to +1. Well, this is from 0 to +1. So you can hear the difference there. This is a random waveform. So it creates that sample and hold kind of effect. This is also random, but it has a little bit of a glide thing going on. So instead of stepping between values like this one does, it kind of glides to the values. So these are the features of LFO1. LFO2 is very similar. Let's actually set up LFO2 to modulate the cutoff of filter 1. So I'll click here, choose cutoff 1, and over here I'll choose LFO2. So LFO2 does not have an EG delay control, it just has its frequency control. So these positive values from the middle point all the way up to 20 Hertz is basically the same as the frequency over here. Let me actually turn this off for now and just set this on. I'll explain this in a little while. I'll turn it off for now. So you can hear LFO2 modulating cutoff 1. And it's set to a triangle wave. I can set it to a sawtooth, ramp down, ramp up, square. Not hearing much. There you go. Another square. Random. Random with glide. Now, in addition to setting this LFO to a specific rate in Hertz, when you drag this slider all the way down, you can actually choose musical values. So I can set it to, let's say, a half note. So if I play my session, turn on the metronome. That's a quarter note. Quarter note triplet, eighth note, eighth note triplet, 16 dotted, 16th, and so on and so forth. So this way you have your modulation in sync with your music. So that's LFO2. Now these two envelopes, in fact all these three envelopes can also be assigned to modulate any of the parameters over here. So let's see, let's also modulate the cutoff. So I'll choose cutoff 2 and we'll set the blend all the way here so we only hear this filter. And in the source here I'll choose an envelope, so let's say envelope 2. Let's push up the amount. So you can hear the envelope is basically changing or modulating the cutoff of filter 2. Now this middle section via is a way to control this modulation. So let me go back to the pitch modulation. Push this all the way up. I'll disable these. And let's say I choose mod wheel. So now we have like a double slider here. So just like how we had that in the attack control, we can now set a range for the modulation. So from pretty much no modulation all the way up to the maximum modulation. Let me enter in some notes. We already have this over here. I'll get rid of this pitch bend. And I'll draw in the mod wheel data. So you can hear when the mod wheel is set all the way to its lowest value. There is some modulation, but it's very little. But when the mod wheel is set to its highest value, we have maximum modulation. Let me push that cutoff back up. I'll set it to a triangle wave. So that's mod wheel all the way up, mod wheel all the way down. Very little modulation. And of course you can ramp that up. So that's the VIA control.